The Young and the Restless spoilers. Matt Clark had always thrived in the shadows, existing in that narrow, volatile space between calculated logic and twisted obsession, but the moment he secured Claire and Audra in the abandoned room beneath the warehouse, the darkness around him began to pulse with a purpose far more dangerous than personal spite. This was no impulsive act of violence, no frantic grab for control. This was a meticulously engineered move in a vendetta he had nursed for years, one aimed squarely at Victor Newman, the man he believed had destroyed every chance he ever had at reclaiming his life, his identity, his power. Claire and Audra were not simply hostages, they were leverage, catalysts, necessary components in a plan that had been simmering so long that every detail felt etched into Matt's bloodstream. He revealed this to them with a chilling composure, explaining that Audra was not merely collateral but a strategic piece, a bargaining chip designed to expose Victor's vulnerabilities, penetrate Newman Enterprises from within, and force Victor to face consequences Matt insisted were long overdue. The coldness in his voice made it clear that he did not fear the Newman empire. He intended to dismantle it one fracture at a time, beginning with the people Victor had unknowingly allowed to become weak points in his corporate armor. Audra, once the picture of self-assurance, felt her pulse quicken with every word Matt spoke, each revelation slicing open parts of her past she had stitched shut with desperate precision. Matt gleefully peeled back the layers of history she had buried, beginning with her involvement in the enigmatic scandal known as the Shadow Room case, a chapter she had once believed would never resurface. The Shadow Room had been a place of secrets, corporate espionage, illicit deals masked as entertainment, financial trails that led nowhere, and Audra had played a pivotal yet hidden role behind its most incriminating operations. Matt reminded her of details she wished she could forget, details he had extracted from her during the brief period of misplaced trust she had once offered him, details she had assumed were safe because she had convinced herself Matt was too unstable to retain anything useful. But she had underestimated him. He had stored every confession, every slip of truth, every whispered panic like ammunition, waiting for the moment he could use them to destabilize her completely. His voice echoed against the damp concrete walls as he recounted how he had once helped her orchestrate a complex embezzlement scheme, money siphoned from corporate accounts through a maze of shell companies, disguised as consulting fees, redirected into private hands just long enough before being transferred into accounts that no audit could trace. Without his intervention, Audra might have lost everything, including her freedom. Instead, she built a career on the ashes of her crimes, believing the past had been successfully buried. Matt made certain she now understood that she had never escaped it, she had only escaped because he allowed her to. Claire, who had entered the situation with guarded confidence shaped by her own tumultuous past, felt her world jolt violently as she listened. She had known Audra was ambitious, that she maneuvered through corporate and romantic entanglements with a calculated boldness, but she had never imagined the extent of the darkness threaded through her history. The words embezzlement, shadow room, and cover-up crashed into Claire like a tidal wave, each revelation tearing apart the fragile trust she had been willing to extend during their uneasy alliance. But Matt was not finished. He moved closer, his shadow stretching across the floor, as he insinuated something far worse, hinting that Audra might have been connected to a death never brought to light, a fatality conveniently ruled an accident but whispered about in certain circles as a consequence of someone knowing too much. The implication alone shattered Claire's composure. She felt nausea twist through her stomach as she tried to reconcile the woman she had begrudgingly begun to rely on with the image Matt was painting, a woman capable not only of betrayal but of silently surviving the fallout of someone else's demise. The uncertainty shook her to her core, fracturing the stability she had only recently begun to rebuild, and making her question whether she could trust anyone at all. Not Audra, not herself, not even Kyle, whose unexpected alliance with her now felt fragile enough to collapse under its own weight. The tension in the room became suffocating as Matt continued to tear through Audra's past, forcing her to confront sins she had hidden even from herself. Audra felt the room spin, her breath catching as she realized Matt was not just exposing her history. He was weaponizing it against Claire, ensuring that any bond forming between them would be poisoned before it could strengthen. Audra had prided herself on her ability to reinvent herself, to step over the ruins of her missteps and present the world with a polished, ambitious, powerful woman. But Matt's exposure of her past crimes left her psychologically stripped, her armor shattered, her composure slipping as she struggled to maintain even a semblance of control. As Claire stared at her with a mixture of horror, confusion, and betrayal, Audra felt something she had not experienced in a long time, genuine fear, not of Matt, but of the truth finally catching up to her. Yet beneath the panic, a fierce survival instinct ignited. As Matt turned away, mapping out the next stages of his campaign against Victor Newman, Audra's mind began racing. Not with denial or excuses but with strategies, possible escape routes, ways to twist the situation back into something she could use to her advantage. She knew that if she allowed Matt to control the narrative, she would lose everything. If she allowed Claire to remain shocked and paralyzed, Matt would have the upper hand indefinitely. And if she allowed Victor to learn the truth through Matt's twisted lens, she would be destroyed publicly, legally, and professionally. Her only chance, ironically, was Claire. But Claire's loyalty was now hanging by a thread, pulled taut by fear and betrayal. Audra would have to fight not only for her life but for the fragile possibility that Claire might help her escape before Matt enacted the next step in his vendetta. Claire, meanwhile, battled her own whirlwind of emotions. She knew what it meant to be judged for one's past, to be defined by mistakes made long before redemption felt possible. But hearing the full extent of Audra's involvement in crimes far darker than corporate sabotage left her reeling. The alliance she and Kyle had formed, a strategic yet unexpectedly stabilizing relationship, now felt tainted by everything Matt had revealed. If she managed to escape, how could she explain this situation to Kyle? How could she ask him to trust her when she wasn't even sure she could trust the woman trapped beside her? And yet, despite the unease gnawing at her, Claire could not ignore the reality in front of her. Audra was terrified too, and whatever their differences, whatever sins filled Audra's past, they were both trapped under Matt's control now. The larger threat was Matt, not each other. Matt paced the room with chilling purpose, outlining aloud the blueprint of his plan to force Victor into submission. Blackmail, corporate infiltration, strategic exposure of Newman's secrets, and using Audra as a bargaining chip to ensure Victor had no choice but to engage. He intended to manipulate Claire's capture too, framing it as a consequence of the Newman family's negligence, positioning himself as the avenger of those Victor had wronged over the years. Every piece of his scheme was designed to pierce Victor's legendary emotional armor and pull him into a confrontation on Matt's terms. Claire and Audra understood that their window of escape was narrowing by the second. A silent agreement formed between them through fragile, trembling, built on fear rather than trust, but it was enough. They exchanged a glance, each recognizing that surviving meant cooperating, and that Matt was far too consumed by his hatred for Victor to notice the subtle shifts in their posture, their breathing, their readiness to act. But escape would not be easy. The room was locked, and Matt, though distracted, was still unpredictable, dangerous, and fully in control of the environment. Yet desperation sharpened their instincts. If they could exploit even one moment of distraction, if they could find one structural weakness in Matt's arrogance, they might break free. Meanwhile, across Genoa City, Kyle received a fragment of information, a message, a warning, an instinct that Claire was missing. Something in him snapped to attention. The alliance he had formed with Claire had been complicated from the start, layered with unspoken tension, mistrust, and unexpected solidarity. But the moment he learned she had vanished, everything inside him shifted from cautious partnership to urgent determination. He began searching for her in Audra without hesitation, retracing steps, analyzing patterns, recalling every clue Claire had shared, no matter how small. As he moved through the city, he found himself re-evaluating every interaction he and Claire had shared, questioning whether he had truly understood her motives or whether deeper forces had been pulling strings he hadn't seen. The thought that Claire might be in danger clawed at him, awakening a protective instinct he didn't fully recognize yet couldn't ignore. Kyle knew that finding Claire would mean confronting Matt Clark, a man known for surviving death, deception, and destruction with an uncanny ability to return stronger each time. And Kyle, unlike Victor or Nick or even Noah, had never faced someone like Matt before. But he felt the weight of responsibility settle over him as he pieced together the fragmented clues. Because whatever imperfections existed in his alliance with Claire, he knew with absolute certainty that he could not let her face Matt alone. And somewhere in the darkness where Claire and Audra struggled to maintain hope, the faintest thread of possibility connected them to Kyle's pursuit, pulling their fates toward a confrontation neither side was prepared for but none could escape. Claire and Audra woke slowly, as if dragged up from a suffocating darkness that refused to let go, their senses struggling to piece together fragments of consciousness until the cold, unyielding truth settled over them like a shroud. They were no longer in the place they last remembered, no longer in control of their own bodies, no longer surrounded by even the slightest illusion of safety. Instead, they found themselves in a damp, windowless underground chamber where a single flickering bulb cast weak, jaundiced light across cracked concrete walls and rust-stained floors, the kind of space built not for living beings but for storing forgotten things, things someone wanted to hide. Their wrists and ankles were secured by heavy chains bolted deep into the floor, cutting off any chance of free movement, and the metallic clinking that echoed each time they shifted made their captivity feel even more oppressive. The air was thick with moisture and the faint scent of decay, as if no one had stepped foot in this place for decades until Matt Clark resurrected it for his own twisted purpose. It didn't take long for them to understand they had been lured deliberately, methodically into a trap, every step engineered by Matt with a predator's patience, waiting until they had no room left to question or resist before taking them someplace no one would ever think to look. When he finally appeared, stepping into the pale circle of light with a calmness more terrifying than any rage, he wasted no time revealing the depth of his plan. He fully intended to use them, both of them, as instruments in a long-nurtured revenge against Victor Newman, a revenge fueled not by impulse but by years of festering hatred and meticulous planning. Matt explained his intentions with a chilling clarity, reminding them that physical violence was unnecessary when psychological torment could achieve the same effect more efficiently. He dragged their fears to the surface, forcing Claire to relive every misstep that had nearly cost her a place in the Newman family, and reminding Audra of every buried crime, every deception she had layered over her past like a cheap coat of paint destined to peel. His words broke through their defenses with surgical precision, targeting their insecurities, unraveling their resolve, stripping them of the illusions they had crafted about strength or independence. Yet for all the animosity that had existed between Claire and Audra, all the hostility, competition, mistrust, and unspoken contempt, Matt's manipulation pushed them into a reluctant but unavoidable truth. Survival would require them to set aside everything they disliked about each other and cling to the one thing they still shared, an unwillingness to die in this place or allow Matt to use them as pawns. It was during one of these moments, when Matt stepped away to answer a call, that Claire shifted her weight and felt a faint draft on her leg, a whisper of cold air that shouldn't have existed in a sealed room. Following the sensation, she saw what looked like a thin crack running along the base of the wall, barely visible beneath grime and dust. She leaned closer, ignoring the strain on her chains, and scraped her fingertips along the edge. To her surprise, part of the plaster crumbled under her touch, exposing a narrow gap and, beneath it, a piece of old metal pipe streaked with rust. It was nothing more than a sliver of possibility, but in a place where no hope existed, even the smallest anomaly became a lifeline. Audra, noticing Claire's sudden shift in attention, leaned in as far as her restraints allowed and immediately recognized something Claire had not: the pipe wasn't random. It might once have been part of an air circulation system, or a defunct emergency exhaust route, or even a maintenance conduit intended to connect different sections of the abandoned structure. Its current state didn't matter as much as the fact that it represented an opening, a structural weakness, a connection to something beyond these walls. And even more importantly, the pipe could potentially carry sound. Audra, whose skills extended far beyond corporate manipulation and into technical fields she rarely advertised, quickly deduced that with the right rhythm, pressure, and method, they might be able to turn the pipe into a primitive communication line, sending a coded signal through the metal that could travel farther than any scream ever would. With this realization came the fragile formation of a plan, one created wordlessly through glances and subtle gestures because speaking openly risked catching Matt's attention. Claire would work on widening the crack whenever Matt stepped away, loosening debris piece by piece until the pipe became fully accessible. Audra, meanwhile, analyzed the acoustics by tapping the chain lightly against the pipe during moments when Matt's pacing or rambling masked the noise. She mapped out the vibration patterns, calculated the reverberation paths, and tried to determine what the pipe connected to, whether it led to another basement level, an old ventilation shaft, or perhaps somewhere near the outer foundation of the building. If she could generate a patterned sequence of taps, she might be able to create a signal distinct enough for someone outside to hear, someone who might recognize it as unnatural and investigate. Their cooperation, fragile and full of tension, slowly shifted into something more functional as they worked, their shared desperation dissolving the hostility that had once felt immovable. Claire began to see Audra not as a rival or a threat but as someone who had been shaped by fear just as she had, someone who hid her vulnerabilities behind polished ambition the way Claire hid hers behind practiced resilience. Audra, in turn, saw Claire as more than a Newman pawn or a damaged girl clawing her way back from disgrace. She saw intelligence, tenacity, and a quiet strength that made her realize Claire was not nearly as breakable as she once assumed. But Matt was not a fool. Over time he sensed a change in the atmosphere, subtle but unmistakable, the kind of shift that occurs when fear transforms into determination. The silence between the two women no longer felt hollow. Their eyes no longer darted away from each other but communicated with intention. Suspicion prickled in Matt's mind, prompting him to increase surveillance, tighten their restraints, and visit them more frequently. Yet his arrogance worked in their favor. He enjoyed the performance of control so much that he often forgot to watch the details, the minor shifts he considered beneath his attention. He believed the chains, the isolation, and the psychological warfare would be enough to break them long before they ever conceived of escape. He believed wrong. When Matt stepped out again to make a call regarding his escalating plot against Victor, confident neither woman had the strength nor clarity to resist, Audra began tapping a coded signal along the pipe. Each impact measured to avoid drawing attention from the room itself but strong enough to travel down the metal conduit. Claire worked simultaneously, digging her nails into the weakened plaster, widening the breach bit by bit until fragments of wall fell away silently at her feet. Their breaths quickened not from fear but from adrenaline, from the intoxicating realization that their plan was no longer just theory but action. Whether anyone would hear the signal, whether the pipe led anywhere meaningful, whether Matt would discover the widening crack before they could use it. None of these uncertainties mattered now. What mattered was movement, momentum, resistance. What mattered was that they were no longer passive victims waiting for Matt's next step but active participants in their own survival. Their escape had officially begun, not with an explosion of force or a dramatic breakthrough, but with a fragile alliance forged in captivity, strengthened by necessity, and held together by a shared refusal to allow Matt Clark to define the rest of their lives. And though danger still loomed like a shadow overhead, though Matt hovered just beyond their reach with the threat of retribution, though every breath carried the risk of discovery, Claire and Audra pushed forward, united not by trust but by survival itself, stepping into the most dangerous stage of their ordeal, one where a single mistake could cost them everything, but where success, however slim, would return them to a world where Matt Clark no longer held the chain around their throats.